Welcome to the We'll Leave Until Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And we have a large crowd today. I'm very happy about this. Today our guest is my old, I guess not classmate. I think we're in the same class every once in a while. Schoolmate from University of Chicago, where when I was doing my PhD there. Dr. Mohamed was doing his PhD in sociology, University of Chicago. And then he ended up, like me, coming to Washington, D.C. To work at the Pew Research Foundation, where he is a research associate for Pew Research Center's Religion and Public Life project. And he's been involved in designing, implementing many of the domestic religious polls. Haven't you done some of the worldwide ones?
Yeah,
too?
I've also worked on that.
The worldwide ones as well. And these are really, really useful resources. If you're interested in, these always show up on, well, I don't know. For me, they show up on my Facebook page. People post them all the time. What Muslims think about this, what Muslims think about that, how Muslims dress. They're really useful and very easily digested sources of information, and you can find them easily on the Pew Research Foundation's webpage. So having him come and speak to us, it's like going, it's like getting the horse's mouth to come here as opposed to going to the horse's mouth. And he's going to talk to us about working with the American Muslim community. And he's also written his book, The Implications of Religious Identity for American Muslims, as well as another book, Muslim Immigrants Hurt by Recession But Not Complaining. It's a nice title. So he's going to speak to us, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. I certainly have lots of questions, so we can take advantage of him being here to get all the answers we can. Please go ahead.
Thanks. So as I'm going through, I will also say, if you see a question on a specific slide, feel free to stop me. I know some presenters get a little thrown off by that. I don't mind, so feel free to stop along the way. What I'm going to talk about is, as it says, understanding American Muslims using survey data. Broadly speaking, this is going to address two issues. One is, what sorts of questions can we answer about the American Muslim community using survey data? The Pew Research Center does a lot of work with surveys with Muslims and other religious groups in the U.S. and globally. And so I'm going to talk about what sorts of questions can we answer? What sorts of data have we found at the Pew Research Center, and drawing on some other sources? But then about halfway, two-thirds of the way through the talk, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the questions and issues that this sort of survey data raises. Because surveys are a very powerful tool. I've devoted a fair amount of my academic work to working with them. But the fact is they have serious limitations. And sometimes within the surveys themselves, you can see the limitations of these surveys. And so I'm going to talk about what are some of the limitations of the surveys, and what are some of the things that you really can't answer with surveys, that you need to sort of come to the survey understanding certain issues and make decisions using other sorts of tools. So to start off, here's a sort of simple question that we've put onto some of our surveys and that we have on our website right now for a religious knowledge quiz. Now, I'm guessing everyone here knows the answer to this question, so I'm not going to ask. I'm going to embarrass anyone. But here's a question. About what percentage of the American public knows what religion Ramadan is associated with? Anybody have any guesses?
20%.
20%.
10%.
10%?
5%.
5%. Half. So it is actually half. So they're not quite as bad off as the American public is not quite as bad as some people think. Although they're not particularly great. I mean, this isn't a hard question.
But to be fair, if this is Price is Right, you'd still lose. No,
No, she's still under. She didn't go over.
Bad. I need to watch more Price is Right.
A similar question about the Holy Book of Islam. We get a similar response. About half of the public knows the answer to this question. Now, lack of knowledge about Islam does not prevent the American public from having opinions about Islam. So another question that we've asked is, for example, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of Islam? And despite the fact that, as we've seen, about half the American public doesn't know very basic questions about Islam, most people give some sort of answer. They've got some opinion, favorable or unfavorable. And what we find is that whether or not someone has a favorable or unfavorable opinion has a lot to do with whether or not they happen to know someone who's Muslim. So if we ask, we ask two separate questions. You happen to know someone that's Muslim, and then we ask separately later on in our survey, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of Islam? And we find among people that know someone that's Muslim, about 4 in 10, just about a little less than half, have a favorable opinion. And among people who don't know anyone that's Muslim, most of the more common response is to have an unfavorable view. So people who know a Muslim tend to have a favorable view. People who don't know a Muslim tend to have an unfavorable view. Similarly, when we ask, compared to other religions, is Islam more likely to encourage violence or not? We find there's a big difference on whether or not someone knows a Muslim. People who know a Muslim are more likely to say Islam does not encourage violence more than other religions. And people who don't know a Muslim tend to be very divided on this issue. Now, in all these questions, you see some significant number of people that give neither response or no response, say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. So to their credit, there's a significant percentage that knows that they don't know, that admit that I don't know anything about Islam, and so I'm not going to venture an opinion on this issue. But most people are perfectly happy to give opinions on these issues. But this split on whether someone knows a Muslim or doesn't know a Muslim raises another issue that survey data is helpful to understand, although it's imperfect, which is how many Muslims there are in the U.S. So we have a variety of estimates that we've done. Right now, our estimate places the total Muslim population as about 1% of the public. So somewhere on the order of 3 million Muslims in the U.S. is our estimate. Now, estimates from various organizations vary pretty widely. You'll see estimates as low as like 1.5 million and as high as 10 million. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking through why we have this estimate that we have of about 3 million. And another pattern you'll see that I'll talk through is the fact that the numbers are sort of increasing. If you go back to 2007 and up to, we project out to 2030, and we expect the number of Muslims to grow. We've seen it grow in our previous data, and we expect that trend to continue. Now, this slide right here has a variety of things. It has estimates based on surveys that we've conducted. We conducted 2 major surveys of Muslims in the U.S., one in 2007 and another in 2011. And so there are estimates based on those surveys. And then we have these projections. 2010. In 2007, we did a projection for 2010 that you can still find on our website. We have a projection for 2020 and 2030, which isn't actually based on a specific survey that we did in 2030, obviously. It's based on data we have and sort of what do we expect to see. Now, the 2007 and 2011 surveys, the way that we conducted them is we called lots and lots and lots of people, and we asked them what their religion was, and if they were Muslim, we asked a variety of more detailed questions. In 2007, we called 500,000 households in order to interview about 1,000 Muslims. In 2011, we called even more. And we did interviews not just in English, but also in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Now, this is actually this language issue is one of the reasons why you get fairly low estimates from a lot of surveys. According to our analysis, most of the American Muslim adult population is foreign born. And so what that means is that many of them are not going to have English as their first language, or not going to be comfortable doing surveys in English. If you call them up in English and say, will you do a survey, it's not going to work. And so we went out of our way to make sure that we covered the languages that people were that Muslims are most likely to speak. Obviously, we can't cover every language that Muslims in the U.S. speak. Muslims from the U.S. come from a wide range of countries. And in a lot of countries, there are multiple languages within the specific country. I mean, this is something when we do international studies, we find, if we study certain countries, we'll have to do 5, 6, 7, 8 languages within the one country to get a broad coverage. And so when we get immigrants coming to the U.S., there's always a limitation within the surveys of, well, what languages did you do them in? And who are you excluding by doing it in only these languages? Now, the projections that I mentioned, the way that these work is we look at a population estimate. We estimate fertility rates. It turns out that Muslims tend to have higher fertility, so they tend to have more children than the larger American public. Mortality estimates, so how many people do we expect to die based on the age structure and other factors. And then, what do we expect from immigration? And we sort of put all that together, and we can do there. And we can get an estimate of what the population is, not just at the point in time that we're looking at, but skipping ahead. Well, in 2020, what do we expect the population to be? In 2030, what do we expect the population to be? We can also work backwards. We didn't actually have any data in 1990, but we can estimate what do we think it was in 1990, given what we know about these demographic factors. So another issue, so if you believe our numbers, about 1% of the American public is Muslim. But that doesn't mean that everywhere in the U.S., 1% of the American public is Muslim. Muslims are not evenly distributed across the country. This is an estimate. This map is actually based on the U.S. Census, which, as some of you probably know, does not ask religion. So this is one of the limitations that we have to work with, is that the U.S. Census is the go-to for all demographic factors, but they don't ask religion. As a matter of policy, they asked it once in 1954, I want to say, at which point Muslims really didn't come up at all. But they don't, as a matter of policy, ask it. So we can look at that and look at ancestry, language, et cetera, and get some sense. And what that sense tells us is that Muslims are not going to be, Muslim immigrants at least, are not going to be evenly distributed. So here the darker colors are counties where there are higher densities of Muslims. And the lighter colors are places where there are lower densities of Muslims. And you'll see huge section geographically of the country has a very low density of Muslims, whereas other parts of the country have very high densities. Now these numbers in the corner are actually our survey-based estimates. So in certain very high density areas, about 7% of the American public lives in sort of high density areas, places like New York, places like DC. But about 1 in 4 Muslims lives in this area. So this means two things. This means, one, that in these areas, non-Muslims are more likely to interact with Muslims. It also means in this area, Muslims are more likely to encounter and interact with Muslims. And in this area, my estimate of about 1% is actually not accurate. And so whenever very often if I talk to lay Muslims that are not involved in literature at all, and they're from an area like DC or New York or Dearborn, they're saying, it can't possibly be 1% because look around my neighborhood. And the fact of the matter is they're right. In their neighborhood, it's much higher. In their city, it's much higher. In their county, it's much higher. But they're ignoring these areas. They've never had any reason to go to this area. They don't have any family in this area. They don't have any friends in this area. But that's going to bring down the overall Muslim percentage in the country. Here's another way to look at this. Like I said, that first slide was based on the census, which is problematic because it's ethnicity. This is actually a map of where mosques are located. And you see the same pattern, right? There are certain areas where you have very high clusters, the same places that we were just looking at. There's lots of mosques here, lots of mosques here, lots of mosques here, none here. This whole state has, one over in the corner here, one over in the corner. I mean, what about if you're the one Muslim that lives there? So across a variety of measures, we have verification of this fact that Muslims are not evenly distributed across the country. And as I alluded to before, interacting with Muslims has implications for the views of the general public. And so the views of the general public on Muslims are going to vary by these geographies. This sort of interaction also has implications for Muslims themselves. I mentioned how it has it affects people's views of the number of Muslims that live in the country based on the number of Muslims they interact with on a daily basis. But it turns out if you ask questions about foreign policy, if you ask questions about sort of government involvement in various issues, people that are Muslim themselves and have a lot of Muslim friends are sort of deeply embedded in these sort of religious networks tend to have different sorts of views than people that are not embedded in these religious networks, even if they still identify as Muslim. Now, this pattern actually holds for a variety of religious and ethnic groups as well. It turns out that when you have a fairly closed network of sort of social ties, if everyone's like you in certain ways, you tend to have different views than if you have a very wide social network and you interact a lot with people who are very different from you. So here's one example, like I said, for Muslims and their views on the U.S. efforts to combat international terrorism. Is this a sincere effort or not? And Muslims that have a lot of Muslim friends are less likely to think that this effort is sincere. And Muslims that are more distant from the Muslim community more largely are more likely to sort of trust that the U.S. government is doing the right thing, is being sincere in their efforts. It's worth noting that whether or not someone we interview has a lot of Muslim friends or not, they're still more likely than the general public to be, they're more skeptical than the general public.
How can you tell what sincere means? You know what I'm asking?
Yes, I do, and it's a very good question. The short answer is we can't, which is why the important measures are how does the response to the question vary. Now, I've actually done some more, and surveys can't get at what people mean by sincere. People mean very different things by sincere. Now, I've done some in-depth interviewing on this particular question, and it turns out that sincere very often does not mean that they think that it's a good idea. Among the Muslim community, among people who say that it's a sincere effort, there's still a lot of skepticism that it's a good idea. There's this, yes, the government is trying, they're sincere, they want this to work, but my God, what are they thinking? Why do they think this will work? But that's not something that you can get out of this sort of closed-coded, is it a sincere effort or not a sincere effort question.
I realize that, but when you come out with such a statement, what does it say to the rest of the public who look at it? That, like 45% of Muslims believe that the government is insincere.
I mean, I think on the face of it,
What I'm asking?
I do, and I think that on the face of it, what it suggests, and I think this is an accurate suggestion, is that the Muslims in the U.S. are more skeptical.
So why don't you ask if they're skeptical rather than sincere? You know what I mean?
I do. I don't actually know why you didn't use.
Skeptical is a big word.
I mean, so that's a good point. So if we were to switch from, the fact of the matter is though, if we were to switch from sincere to skeptical, there are other issues that would come up, right? Any word is going to have a lot sort of built into it. Like that's just the nature of language. And so when we ask these closed-coded questions, we know that it's going to mean different things for different people, and it's going to be interpreted in a variety of ways, which again is why we try to focus on these sort of comparative measures. Whatever sincere means, there are fewer Muslims that think that it's sincere. Now, what sincere means, I mean, we can look at the dictionary and say, well, it means this, and other people say, well, that's not really what it means in my context, but Jack does bring up a good point that one of the concerns we have when we design these is we can't use sort of academic technical terms, and we can't use sort of SAT words because most people in the public don't understand them, but they'll still answer. Much like people are like, I've never met a Muslim, I don't know anything about Islam. Well, what do you think about this? Oh, well, I have this opinion. People are very happy to give opinions when they don't know, because they don't want to seem to be the guy who doesn't know the word or doesn't know the issue. Does that make sense?
I do. And understand what you're saying, but it bothers me that you even asked that question. Do you know why?
Why?
Because it gives an impression that for the one who's answering it, that maybe it's the CIA or the FBI trying to see if this person is against the government or not.
Well,
Because I mean, it depends what the question is.
Wait, I mean, this new movie, Captain America: Winter Soldier, right? I mean, Americans generally seem to love movies about how the American government is doing evil stuff. They just, when it comes to certain issues, I mean, I think that, I mean, I understand your concerns, but I think that there's enough of that floating around the U.S. consciousness overall that it's not like, sort of singularly damning for Muslims. And if it is, I think it's more a product of overall Islamophobia than.
I'm just defending Besheer.
I know.
but one second. One other. I think one other thing that's worth pointing out is a question like this, which, to be honest, is something that for a lot of Muslims and a lot of people in general would sort of get their hackles up, like, well, "What are you asking me?" Is something that we wouldn't ask early in the survey. This is one of the survey design technique that what you'll do is you'll open with sort of softer questions. And then after you've been on the phone with someone for 15 or 20 minutes, they'll hear a question like this and they won't be like, well, what are you doing? Why are you asking me this? You've had a conversation with this person over the phone for 15 or 20 minutes and they're comfortable with you. And at that point, you ask a question like this and you get a lot of people comfortable answering. Whereas if we were to ask this as the first question, we'd get a lot of people just hanging up on us. But there was another question?
You partially answered my question, but I was just wondering, when you're doing surveys like this, and you're doing it by phone,
Mhm.
I'm figuring,
Yes.
and you just get somebody that, really is interested, but you're sort of talking to somebody on the fly a little bit, answering these questions, right?
Yeah.
So
That's very true.
that's,
And-
that's what I'm wondering about.
That is true, and I think that there are two issues with this sort of asking on the fly. One is, what happens if you ask someone a question that they've never thought about? So you're asking someone about an issue, and they legitimately have no opinion, like, I've never really thought about that before. And this isn't specific to Muslims or specific to this survey, but in general, we ask people about, what do you think about, such and such law? What do you think about such and such issue that's going on, in Congress, or this international issue? And we ask, well, what do you think about that? And people tend to want to answer, even if they don't actually, if they've never thought about it. And so, if you listen to these interviews, very often you'll hear people sort of stop. When you ask a question that people haven't thought about, you'll hear them sort of stop. They're like, wow, And then they'll give you, they'll make up an answer that sort of fits with what they think more broadly. And there are some real concerns around, doing that. So we try to ask questions that we think people are going to be familiar with, are going to have an opinion on. I think that if you ask most people about the U.S. efforts to combat terrorism, people know what that is in the U.S. If you ask, in 2007, we asked a similar question about the war on terror. I think most people in the U.S. in 2007 knew what the war on terror was. And most people had some opinion about the war on terror, good, bad, and different. And so we felt comfortable asking this question. Although you'll see there is a significant number of people who don't answer. Even in the general public, almost 1 in 10 people didn't give a response or didn't give one of these responses. But that's something that we have to think about as we're designing the questions. We have to ask about topics that are relevant, because otherwise people will sort of make up responses. Again, because people don't want to seem like, oh, of course I know, where Chechnya is. Of course I know, what's going on and such. There have been tests on for survey design where, people have been asked about made-up countries and made-up laws. And most people will then proceed to give you an answer. And so you have to be very careful to make sure that you're measuring something real. because this is one of the limitations of surveys. People don't want to seem stupid. You know, the people who call them seem to be, you know, articulate and intelligent, and well, I'm smart too. You asked me about this thing. Oh, I guess I should know the answer. You wouldn't be asking me if I shouldn't know the answer. And so this is part of the art and the science that goes into designing these questionnaires, is that you have to be very careful that you're measuring something real. So there's just another question where there's a similar pattern. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on that. But I am going to sort of skip ahead to one of the issues with these questions, specifically the, you know, do you happen to know someone who's Muslim question. What do Muslims look like? How would you know if you happen to know someone who's Muslim? Unless they're very, you know, for some reason you're in a context where you talk about religion all the time. You know, if there's someone in your chemistry class that's Muslim, why would you know that? You know, not all Arabs in the U.S. are Muslim. Not all South Asians in the U.S. are Muslim, despite the fact that many Muslims are either Arab or South Asian. You know, if we spend a little bit of time on the immigrants from India, we have a fun little interactive about this. So here's a map showing the major sending countries of immigrants to the U.S. You know, you'll see, you know, Mexico is 12 million, is sort of far and away the largest, right? But if you go over to someplace like India, it does send a lot of immigrants, over 1 million. So there are lots of Indian immigrants to the U.S. But if you look at the people who are leaving India, first of all, most of them are not Muslim. Only about 1 in 4 immigrants from India are Muslim. And then most of them aren't coming to the U.S. You know, Saudi Arabia has just about as many Indian immigrants as the United States. Now, if we're trying to guess, which country do you think has more Muslim immigrants from India? Saudi Arabia or the United States? As you might guess, you know, lots of Muslims that are leaving India are going to go to Saudi or Oman and not bother going to the United States. It turns out that when people are immigrating, one of the things they think about is what religion is most common in the country they're going to. Sort of the ethnic fit, the religious fit. And one of the reasons for that is because very often churches and mosques and temples play a role in sort of setting up patterns of migration. But another reason is also just it's easier to integrate when you've got certain religious similarities. And so disproportionately, the immigrants to the United States are Christian from all across the world. And it's not really an accident. So, you know, when we ask a question like, you know, do you know someone who's Muslim? What we're really measuring is not do you know someone who's Muslim, but do you know someone who has talked to you about their religion and is Muslim? And it turns out, like I showed before, that's predictive of a variety of attitudes. But it's important to keep in mind that what we're measuring isn't actually do you know someone that's Muslim, but do you know someone who's Muslim and has talked to you about their religion? Hijab's another fun one, right? Okay, so but for women it's not an issue, right? Because Muslim women wear hijab, so you can just tell if someone has hijab, they're Muslim. If they don't, they're not. Turns out that's not true. So this was a survey that we in our survey of Muslims in the U.S. we asked Muslim women, you know, do they wear hijab all the time, most of the time, some of the time, and not at all. Only about 1 in 3 when they're outside. We don't ask just, you know, do you wear it when you're home taking a shower? Do you wear your hijab? The question, I don't remember the exact wording, but it said, you know, when you're out in public, do you wear how often, if at all, do you wear hijab? And only about 1 in 3 Muslim women in the U.S. say that when they're out in public, they wear a hijab all the time. So this is not the sort of perfect measure that some people assume that it is. Now this is just an interesting, do I have time? This is just an interesting pattern that, that I like to highlight, is that wearing the hijab all the time is actually more common among US-born Muslim women than among foreign-born Muslim women. This is one of these things that people assume, well, if they have hijab and if they're foreign-born and they wear hijab, then that's the perfect indicator. It's like, well, not really. Even for foreign-born Muslims, wearing the hijab is not at all a given. Another thing that you can't use to tell whether or not someone's Muslim is what they do. You know, you ask, well, did you catch the latest episode of this show? You know, hey, you know, I was talking to this person about, you know, the season finale of How I Met Your Mother, and they knew about it, so they're probably not Muslim. Muslims watch TV as often as the public. They, you know, watch sports as often as the public. They play video games as often as the public. And, you know, I've got a whole bunch of measures that, if anyone's interested, we could spend time talking about, of how the sort of bottom line is that Muslims, especially in the U.S., are very well integrated. And so it's not very easy to tell whether or not someone's Muslim.
How do you measure integration or define integration?
That's what all these other slides are. We could talk about, you can measure it by citizenship, you can measure it by satisfaction, you can measure it by income, you can measure it by sort of belief in the American dream, happiness with their community. So there are a variety of ways, you know, voter registration, there are a variety of measures that we can use. And by most of them, what we find is they're pretty well integrated, especially if you compare them to like Muslims in some place like Europe. Most European countries, Muslims are very distinct on a variety of measures. But the other issue I was going to highlight with sort of one of the limitations of surveys is a definitional one.
Real quick. So what I'm really curious is that how do you find Muslims to participate in the survey? Is it some public information site or access information that you have? And how do you know if someone's Muslim? Because, for example, like my name is Ali Zonabad. I don't actually fit a typical Muslim name. And do you go by identifying, oh, they must be Muslim and they have a Muslim sounding name, and so you tap into it. I mean, so there, within itself, I see there's some bias there, or because a lot of progressive Muslims don't, or actually the majority of Muslims don't attend mosque, for example, right? Only 28% do according to CARE. So you've got this vast majority of 72% at least of Muslim Americans that don't belong to a mosque. So how do you reach those unmosqued people? Because their views on Islam and social issues
Are going to be
probably
systematically different.
Yes, correct.
Absolutely. The short answer is we do not go off of name lists. We do not go off of mosque lists. It turns out mosques, unlike a lot of churches, don't keep lists very often anyway. So even if you wanted to go off of mosques lists, there's only so far you could go. What we do, and this was one of the earliest slides I sort of breezed through, is we call lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people. And we ask them, what is your religion? And again, this isn't the first question we'll ask. We'll spend 5 minutes on the phone talking about various issues, and then we'll say, what is your religion? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Mormon? And it's a whole list. And if someone says they're Muslim, then they get our Muslim cert. So our analysis is always self-identified. That's the beginning and the end of our definition. Does this person say they're Muslim? If yes, they're Muslim. If no, they're not. Doesn't matter whether or not they had Muslim names. Doesn't matter if they have Muslim parents. Doesn't matter if they've ever been to the mosque. I mean, because we actually have an analysis as well about how often Muslims go to the mosque. I don't remember the exact number, but it's pretty significant numbers that don't go very often.
Also, in this study, was this one also just to the United States? Because one thing that the past Pew studies on Muslims always included the Canadian community, which skewed the numbers towards the South Asians and the Arabs compared to the overall African American community. So in this one, is it kept to the
Yeah, it's in the not the it's in the U.S. states, including Hawaii and Alaska, but not Canada. But this question, are Shias Muslim? This is one of these things that surveys can give us some sense as to why it's an important question to ask, because there's not a consensus. This is across a variety of countries. We didn't ask this in the U.S. In the U.S., it turns out the split tends to not be are Shias Muslim, but is the Nation of Islam Muslim? That's the question, the equivalent question that we would ask in the U.S. I think, because the Sunni-Shia split tends to not be very important among American Muslims. But ask someone who's Sunni whether or not the Nation of Islam is Muslim, you will get quite a discussion. Turns out the Nation of Islam, they consider themselves Muslim. If you ask them whether or not they're Muslim, they say yes. If you ask a Sunni whether or not they're Muslim.
Well, I just note just roughly, the answer seemed inversely proportional to the other surveys I've seen on religiosity. So usually the Kyrgyzstans and Kosovo, they're there's very low religiosity, and yet they have the lowest numbers on whether because
Yeah, I mean that's true.
so it's like viewers who would assume that kind of religious intolerance is directly proportional to religious fervor.
Mm-hmm. And that's not borne out by the data. I think part of what you're picking up is the fact that if religion is an ethnicity and not a set of beliefs and practices, then you have your definitions in a very different way. Another pattern that we've found in our analysis is that whether or not there's a significant presence of Shias in the country is pretty relevant.
Azerbaijan is a huge Shiite community.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Indonesia, not so much. So that pattern actually, if you sort of do a broader analysis, that pattern of having a lot of Shias in the community actually tends to not create divisions, but break them down.
Is it what you estimate that there are 90% of people in Azerbaijan have Shia's background, or is it?
No.
people
This
think that 90% of
this is what this is saying is that in Azerbaijan, 90% of Sunni Muslims say that Shias are also Muslims.
so Muslim people in Azerbaijan?
Sunni
It's
Muslim
here.
people.
Muslim Sunnis.
Mhm.
Because I'm quite surprised about the Turkey statistic, 60%.
Mhm.
It's totally new to me. That,
Would you have expected it to be higher or lower?
Much lower.
Mm. Interesting.
Because estimation of people who live in Turkey, Sunni Muslims who live in Turkey, and think that 60% Shias live in Turkey, then it's kind of not. No. Yeah. Yeah.
So these aren't population estimates. This is definition. This is a question of whether or not you consider people of another denomination to be in the same religion or not. That's the question that this tries to answer.
It's the same correlation true with Nation of Islam, the presence of Nation of Islam.
Well, we haven't actually see that.
Do you get that data?
We don't have that data. We don't have that data. Next time we're going to ask that question.
Sorry, what was your question?
Does he have that data for the Nation of Islam? How do you have that yet?
Yeah, we don't have that data. Here's another definitional issue. Can you be Muslim and not believe in God? Can you be Muslim and not believe in the Quran? Can you be Muslim and not believe in angels? And it turns out, the responses for the U.S. and overall vary, but in very few countries do you have 100% of people who say they're Muslim believing in these things. Now in the U.S., for this sort of belief in one God and the Prophet Muhammad, you get 96%, so 19 out of 20 Muslims in the U.S. say that they believe these things. But 1 in 20 is not an insignificant number.
So what is the meaning of this band?
So the band, so what this is the internet. The band is the range of international views. So across the countries that we've looked at, what's the lowest that we find of people saying this, and what's the highest? And this is the average internationally. The global median is sort of the international average. And I can pull up the list of which countries. And then the U.S. Muslims is, in the U.S., what do we find? So 96% of Muslims in the U.S. say that they believe in one God, Allah, and the Prophet Muhammad. So that's about 96%, is about 19 out of 20. So that leaves about 1 out of 20 who don't say that they believe these things. And in more sort of qualitative interviews, I've encountered people that have these sorts of views, and they still consider themselves solidly Muslim, despite the fact that they question or doubt or reject things that a lot of other Muslims think are absolutely crucial. I mean, one of the people that was coding my qualitative interviews happened to be Muslim, and was coding was doing the transcript for someone, one of these sort of more sort of culturally Muslim, as she described herself, and my coder came in and was like, "This is wrong." I'm like, what do you mean this is wrong? It's like, this person is wrong. Can you find this person and contact them and tell them that they can't do that? At which point I'm like, well, I'm glad that I stripped all the identifying information before I gave you that to code. But these things can be very contentious. There are people that have very clear theological definitions of inclusion and exclusion. And then there are people that very clearly don't fit those definitions but still consider themselves part of the community. And this is not something that surveys can decide for you. In the surveys, we find that there are people that have these wide range of views. Now, as a researcher, as an analyst, you may want to focus on people that have a certain set of beliefs or are within a certain denomination or any number of criteria. But that's something that as a researcher you bring to your analysis, not something that the analysis can give you.
Sorry to keep asking questions, it's so interesting. So this second question, the Quran should be read literally word for word. If we got, I don't know any Muslim scholar, any member of the ulama who would say the Quran should be read literally word for word. Right? So does this mean that people are saying, no, you don't read it literally because oftentimes it's figurative? Or are they saying, no, it's not really binding in my life, it's not really authoritative? Like, what is this, how do you think this question is understood?
The short answer is it's hard to know. I mean, my suspicion, having looked in more depth at the data, is that a lot of people are saying something along the lines of a lot of it should be read figuratively, and not this shouldn't be binding in my life. So I would personally be very hesitant, even if I were interested in using a sort of theological orthodoxy criteria, I'd be very hesitant to use a question like this for that. The fact of the matter is this question works a lot, is one of these questions that we ask internationally across wide swaths of various religious groups, and it works really well for Christian orthodoxy, which is sort of what it was designed for. For Muslims, it doesn't actually measure orthodoxy.
Do you have a definitive question in the same tone as the first one, where it's a choice of yes or no? You believe in one God and a prophet, saying, do you believe the Quran is the word of God or not? Because this just says, do you believe you should read it literally, but not actually a direct question saying, well, do you believe the Quran is the word of God or not?
No, we don't. We don't have a question like that.
Can you extrapolate from the Quran question about people's opinions about Sharia? Because I've interviewed many legal scholars who teach Sharia, and some of them say it's absolutely immutable. And then there are people like Al-Naim, Emory, who says it's not, it's man-made, so it's not immutable. So that's pretty black and white. Can you extrapolate from that question about Sharia, or is it just
I
the
would-
Quran in general?
You can't extrapolate. It turns out we do have a battery of questions that we've asked specifically about Sharia. I don't have them here because we didn't ask them in the U.S. and I wanted to sort of focus on sort of questions that we can look at in the U.S. But we have asked a whole battery of questions about Sharia internationally. Should it be? Should it apply? Should it apply? To non-Muslims? Should this particular Hudud be applied? What about this one? What about this one? We have probably a dozen questions that probe
Do
various
you ask
aspects.
if it's immutable, can it be open to interpretation, or is it
I don't remember what that's specifically a
just a
question.
matter
you
of
asked.
interpretation?
But let's talk afterwards, because like I said, we asked a variety of questions, in that vein in a whole host of Muslim countries. Which is one of the reasons why I say that I would not use this question as an orthodox, because I know that it correlates to some of these other sort of Sharia questions, but not perfectly.
When is your next US story going to be?
I don't know.
You have to have another one.
Oh, I agree.
And he has to do some real follow-up questions on some, really dig into some of these issues.
I agree completely, but you wouldn't believe me if I told you how expensive they
Oh,
are.
I would. You're calling 700 and something thousand people, yes, I'm sure it is very expensive.
So we talk about when we want to do it again. We did one in 2007, we did another in 2011. So if we were to follow that trajectory, it'd be 2015, 2016, we would do it again. But I don't know that that's actually what happened. But just for variety, I wanted to highlight some of the implications of these sorts of definitional questions on another group that we've actually, done some work on. So for U.S. Jews, a lot of these same questions come up about who's in and who's out. Is it just a religion? Can you be Jewish and have no religion, but be sort of culturally Jewish? What if your parents aren't both Jewish, et cetera? And so we have this calculator that we call it, where depending on how you define, if you just mean Jewish adults by religion, that's how many Jews are in the U.S. If you include as broad a definition as you can, the number triples. And a similar process goes into place for Muslims and for just about any religious group, is that these definitional questions are crucial, but surveys can't answer them. This is something that researchers have to come in and say, this is my definition, this is my group, this is why this is my group, these are who I'm excluding, this is why I'm excluding these people, and analyze based on that, because the surveys just can't give you that. And here's just a sense of some of the work that we've done on Muslims in the U.S. and internationally. We've done a number of surveys. We've done some population estimates and projections. And this 2012 survey, the World's Muslims 39 country survey, is the one I was talking about, where we have a number of questions on Sharia. And I'm going to stop here to leave some time for questions.
I have a question. So in 2011, there was a survey. One of the questions, it was an open-ended, it was a graph, and I didn't get to see this in this book or not, but the question was, which of these Muslim organizations do you feel represent you? I don't know if you remember that chart, but the one with the most answer was CARE, and that was 11%, and whereas everybody else was in the single digits, which is really dismal. And then you had a category for other. Do you remember this or not?
I think that was, I think Gallup did that.
Oh, was that Gallup?
I think Gallup did that in 2011.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Organization.
Is that the one John Esposito and
Yes, yeah. Dahlia was there.
How did your world survey compare to theirs?
Ours is better.
Gallup did his thorough world survey. I think Gallup is, they did that the Muslim, 1 billion Muslims thing.
Mm-hmm.
1 billion Muslims, what do 1 billion?
Yeah, I think that the questions in the Pew one, there are many more questions. I think it's much more specific in detail.
I think that the big, there are two sort of differences we're thinking about. One is that specifically for the U.S. survey, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, a lot of the Gallup analysis was part of their larger poll. So Gallup does does more polling overall than we do. And so they would do a larger poll, and then, like I said, we'll ask, and if you're Muslim, you'll get the Muslims, the set of Muslim questions. Gallup did something like that, but because it was part of their larger poll, they had less space to do specifically Muslim questions. Because it was part of a larger poll where they had to ask on a whole lot of other issues of everyone, including the Muslims. Whereas our survey, we were just looking for Muslims, and so we had more space to sort of devote specifically. I also remember in 2011, Gallup did not publish a population estimate. They sort of went out of their way. There's a section in their report that says, we are not going to publish one. This is intentional because there are all these sort of methodological difficulties. The census doesn't ask, and there are limitations to self-reports, and so we're just not going to go there. Whereas we felt like, based on our own previous experience, if we don't put something out there, people are still going to use it. People are still going to make stuff up, and so we might as well put out our best estimate. With all the caveats that, yes, it's true that there are limitations, it's imperfect, but if we stay quiet, it's not like people will stop asking the question.
It's only in your methodology that it's different.
And they ask different questions.
Yeah, but I mean, if academics were going to take and contrast the two studies and go deep into it, that's what they focus on, is your methodology.
Yeah, I think the methodology, and then, like I said, there's some different questions that they ask.
Obviously you have a deep knowledge about Muslims in America, and I'm wondering, based on what you've seen, all of the information that you have, if there's a particular subject or a trend within this community that's really captured your attention, something that's kind of gotten stuck in your head and that you think about during the day and night, and what is that?
I mean, I think for me, the thing that's most interesting is the emerging pattern of sort of cultural Muslims. And sort of being sort of a comparative religion person, I look at, like I said, I look at Muslims, but then I work on Jews and Christians. I see this trajectory having played out in a variety of other groups it's a religion, but then it's a religion and a culture, and then it's primarily a culture. I've seen that sort of historically play out in a variety of other groups, and so it's interesting to see some sort of hints of some of those same things happening among Muslims now, and so I sort of wonder and look for ways that we can measure, is that happening? How quickly is it happening? What's the trajectory?
Would you go so far as to say that you could have a Catholic Muslim, like you could have a Catholic?
We have people that say
cafeteria.
Cafeteria. Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This sort of pick and this sort of pick and choose cafeteria. Yeah. I don't think that's a hypothetical. I think we have that. I think we have survey data to show that we have people that say, I believe this but not this, and I do this but not this.
Or I'm going to borrow this from Buddhism because that fits in with this.
Yeah. I mean, and this sort of syncretism. We see that as well. We actually, on some surveys, we have people that say things like, I am Muslim and I'm Christian. Not in huge numbers, but we have people that say things like that. I think there was an article a couple years ago, and I want to say it was the Times that talked about this issue, that followed someone who was like, I'm Muslim and Christian, and here's why that makes sense to me. But yeah, we absolutely see that. We see that now. We see that a lot with Jews now. People who say that they're Jewish and they're Christian, or Jewish and they're Hindu, and they're Jewish and they're Buddhist, and feel perfectly comfortable with that. And we see that much less among Muslims, but there's reason to think that we might see more of that in the future.
I want to get more into the culturalization of the Muslim identity. And you said there's other groups, and I think, again, you referenced the Jewish community. Now, I know there's many Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, I'm LA and went to UCLA. There's plenty of Jewish Persians.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also the Ethiopian Jews. But still, it's largely a Ashkenazi, white, Jewish population in the United States. And I guess they can have their religious identity intersect with their racial identity as defined in the United States.
Mhm.
But in the United States, when it comes to the issue of identity, race, politics, representation, how does that play out with you saying increasing people who associate themselves as just being culturally Muslim, and how will that play out in the issue of the politics of identity, who has access, who's represented, who's promoted? And I put this in the context where quite often say South Asian and Arabs, largely who are Muslim, their issues are promoted or engaged on as Muslim issues. But say still, where the numbers are at, the 30 to 40%, say African American Muslims, their issues are always promoted as just as black issues, and they're not engaged on, they're constantly left out, even though there's a largely significant, they're still not potentially the largest subgroup of Muslims in the United States, but their issues are never engaged as Muslim issues, though many of us do feel issues of poverty or everywhere that's afflicting it, we see through a prism of our religious identity. So, I mean, where do you see, where's that going, and how's that, this issue of politics and race and identity, if it is becoming more of a cultural identity?
I mean, I think, I definitely think that it's true that when religion and ethnicity intersect, people tend to, as individuals, people tend to not be really good at splitting them out. It's sort of an artificial construct that as researchers we go in and say, this person, well, this is the religious part of the person, and this is the ethnic part of the person, and this is the gender part of the person. People are people, and their issues are their issues. And they're informed by a whole host of things. It's informed by their religion and their background and their economic position and their gender. All of those things inform their decisions. I mean, that's just the nature of identity. Now, when that intersects with power, one person says, this is my identity, and because of that identity, I'm going to, I'm Muslim, and I think these are important issues, so that makes them Muslim issues. If that person in power happens to also have a variety of other things, they're also male, they're also South Asian, etc., versus, women, versus African Americans, etc., that also may have the exact same view. I'm Muslim, and so this makes this a Muslim issue. I think that's not a survey question. I think that but I think that the broader literature on identity highlights the fact that people tend to do this sort of defining process, but then whether or not and tend to project in a certain way.
On your surveys, do you all ask those kind of questions? Do you ask like their race or ethnicity?
Yes.
Or,
Yes.
But do you in that data that you showed us, is that included or incorporated in any kind of way?
Yes, in two ways. I mean, so there was a previous slide where I highlighted, the sort of racial and ethnic breakdowns that I could pull back up. But I think the more interesting thing is the questions where I looked at, well, here's how things vary by whether or not someone's Muslim or not Muslim. In my book, and where I do more detailed sort of quantitative analysis, I do disentangle, well, how much of that is ethnic, how much of that is gender, how much of that is religiosity more broadly, mosque attendance, et cetera. So there's some statistical processes you can use with survey data to disentangle, well, how much of this factor, that factor, the other factor is contributing to a given pattern.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is because, the violent attacks against Sikhs and others, like after 9/11, are anti-Muslim incidents, but they were, it was more so in a certain idea or identity. So when you ask a question and you say, like, you base it on whether a person knew a Muslim or not, I find that, there's a different experience if you're an American indigenous-born Muslim that doesn't have any tie to ethnic heritage from abroad, and whether or not you have an immigrant heritage. The experiences, so of who you know and what you define as Muslim is different. Someone who's born Muslim is like, well, that's Bob, this is Joe, I know him. We play football together. That's different than somebody that's Indo-Pak or Arab that's descendant, and they have a different type of experience. So they're seeing them as other, not just religiously, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've definitely, in sort of the more nuanced analysis, we definitely find that ethnicity plays a very important role in a lot of these predictive patterns.
What sort of trends have you noticed in American Muslim civic engagement more broadly? For example, what percentage of American Muslims vote in elections, and is that rising?
In terms of specifically voting in elections, we don't have good data on that, or whether or not it's rising. We do have some data on citizenship. So this was our 2011 survey. And what we find is Muslim immigrants become citizens at higher rates than a lot of other immigrant groups. So if you compare to Asian immigrants or Latino immigrants, we find Muslim immigrants tend to become citizens at significantly higher rates.
A question of
And then-
a question of integration of Muslims is frequently asked. There was also one slide of the integration of Muslim community in USA.
Mhm.
So what can you find? Can you explain that indigenous Muslims they have this problem, or immigrant Muslims they have problem of integration, or both?
I mean, I think the question of integration means something very different if your family's been in the country for 4 generations, and versus if you've come yourself 2 years ago. It's just a very different. What does it mean to be integrated in that context?
Assimilation. The same
yeah.
term is used, assimilation and integration.
Mhm.
So what is the limitation of assimilation or integration?
I mean, I think the question. I think they're different issues. I think the question that can be productively asked for, say, a community that's lived in the U.S. for many generations, about in terms of Muslim assimilation or integration is, does the religion complicate civic involvement? I think that's, to the extent that there's something productive to ask, I think that's the something. Now, whether or not that's a question worth asking is a sort of a different, broader issue. But I think that's what you're trying to get at, what people are trying to get at, I think, when they ask that question. Is there some reason why, now that these people that have been in this country for generations, now that they have this new religion, and for many of them it is a new religion, most of the African-American Muslim community, it's very largely a convert community. There aren't very many people that have been in the country and been Muslim for 4 generations. Like, that's just not very common in the U.S. And so the question is, now that these people have been in this country for however many generations, and now that they've accepted a new religion, does that change their interaction with their environment in some way? One second, but I think we had one here and one here.
I would like to go back to your statement in terms of emerging color of cultural Muslims.
Mhm.
The term Muslims is used in Europe mostly actually to define immigrant groups
Mhm.
from Europe. So in
Mhm.
that sense, there is certain kind of ethnicization and also racialization
Mhm.
depending on how these groups are kind of presented in the media. And here, I had the impression that you are mentioning this as a kind of positive development, to be not just kind of religion in a sense, but it is kind of culture or intersections of religion and ethnicity. Now, including also his remark in terms of integration, and again, looking at Europe, Muslimness has to do mostly with non-integration. Doesn't matter if people have been living there for 4 generations, 3 generations, or just for a couple of years. Kind of the discourse is quite similar. If you talk about Muslims, you mostly talk about problem groups in many European countries. You haven't mentioned any transatlantic perspectives in your research, but do you know any comparative research, or are you somehow planning to do any comparative research in terms of Muslimness as a culture and kind of integration issues related to different societal contexts?
I think there is. Well, first let me just clarify something. You said that I was sort of talking about it in a positive context. I don't want to give that impression. It's not, as a researcher, it's not good or bad. It just is. And the reality is that there are pretty significantly different patterns of Muslims in the U.S. and Muslims in many Western European countries. in terms of average socioeconomic status, in terms of, you know, the extent to which they live in the same, you know, collectively versus dispersed, in terms of satisfaction with their communities. I mean, these are just sort of objective facts. Whether they're good or bad is a different question. There is some really good, I think, analysis on sort of transatlantic analysis. I haven't done that myself, but if you want to talk to me later, I can give you some references that can talk more about this issue of how do Muslims in the U.S. compare to Muslims in Western Europe. I know you've been waiting patiently for a while there.
Open Society did research. Open Society. Look it up on their website. Very in-depth.
And I just wondered if you have any data to show where this emerging trend, which ethnic group this emerging trend is more prevalent in, whether amongst the Muslims in the U.S., whether of Arab descent, South Asian, East Asian. Is there any data to show which group this trend is more prevalent in?
I haven't actually looked at that question, and I don't know anyone that has. But you could look at that with our data. The 2011 and 2007 data sets are both actually publicly available. So anyone who wanted to sort of download it and do some analysis, like I mentioned, do sort of regression, et cetera. And you could tease out, you know, is this driven largely by certain immigrant groups or by U.S. born or second generation. I mean, but I just don't know anyone who's looked at that much.
Usually decisions are made on the basis of surveys, and in the beginning you told us that the people are not aware about the religion, especially Islam, but they love to pass comment or yes or no. So what would be validity of such surveys? Because on the basis of surveys decisions are taken, and people are not aware about Islam, but they say wrong religion. In 2010, Times reports states that 47% of Americans, they think Islam is not they do not give the favorable opinion. They say Islam is not the religion, a good religion, a religion of hatred or violence. This is so. How to deal this one?
I mean, I think you're touching on two distinct issues. People hold opinions when they don't have information. That's just the nature of how people operate. Now, measuring those opinions, you may be measuring the opinion of someone who has no valid basis that you might consider for that opinion. But that doesn't change the fact that that's their opinion. And it's useful to know that that's their opinion. It's also useful to know what they're basing that opinion on. But it's just the reality that people do base their opinions on very limited information on all those things. We tend to think, if you research, I know that knowing what people think is useful, even if we disagree with the bases of their thinking. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just curious whether my family lived down in New York by the mosque that was the object of all the troubles after 9/11, and we were all just horrified by what happened down there. And I'm wondering if that was part of the survey, if people across the country, Muslims across the country, for example, felt that it was hitting home.
Mm-hmm. We actually did ask a question about that, and it's in. You have a copy of that report? Yeah. In there, I'll point to you afterwards. There's a question about whether, for Muslims, we asked them whether or not they thought that building that mosque was a good idea or a bad idea, and separately whether they think it should be allowed or not allowed. And there's a difference there in the minds of many Muslims between whether or not it should be allowed and whether or not it's a good idea.
Okay, I'm looking at this chart that you have, and from it we're deducing that they're well integrated. But the question is, are they economically integrated? Are they professionally integrated? Are they socially integrated? Or culturally integrated? So that's your question. Ask that. Can you figure out Because we know that a lot of them came for economic reasons. So they're doing well. Of course, 82% will say yes. The question is, do they feel comfortable with their neighbors being nasty to them?
No, that's fair. And you know, this is some of the things that I glassed over, and some of the things in the deeper report do probe into this. We do have a variety of economic measures that you mentioned. We have measures about satisfaction. So here's one sort of about whether hard work is a guarantee of success or not. Right? And we find that Muslims are more optimistic on this issue than the general public. So there are those sorts of measures, and there's a whole host of economic measures we can talk about. But then there are also separate questions about, do you think that the American public overall is friendly toward Muslims or not friendly toward Muslims? We ask that separately. Do you think that the various political parties are friendly toward Muslims or not friendly toward Muslims? Do you think that in 2011 we asked about Barack Obama specifically, do you think he was friendly toward Muslims? So we ask, so we do in the report tease out some of these issues.
And it's about this shifting. There's kind of just known in the Muslim community, but there's no data on it, that at least with immigrants post-65 to mid-80s, early 90s, you had the stereotypical engineers, doctors, or at least they were coming to graduate school, books under their arms to become engineers, doctors, right? But now, in the past 20 years, we have the full movement of a global labor migration movement, which is also largely consumed or represented by Muslims who come to the United States. I mean, not even Somali, which is practically the amount of Somalis who are driving taxi cabs today or up in Queens or whatnot. What is the demographic shift economically, work-wise, professionally, in the community? And then what can somehow be captured? And I know this is germane to what Islamic League is asking for research in our own work. Then what is the perception of Muslim Americans at our own selves, or at least particularly those of first generation or immigrant Muslims who still may perceive themselves as, for lack of a better term, a model minority that, yeah, we are doctors and engineers, we're all well off. There's no poverty in the Muslim American community. And then when we know the reality is that no, especially in light of also the increased number of the majority of refugees coming to the United States are Muslim backgrounds too. To add that on too. So how are you capturing that, looking at that?
I think so. Now the perception question is a little bit trickier, but I think but we've got pretty hard data on actual economics. And what you'll find, so here's an example, right? If we say in 2007, 1% of Muslims are making less than 20, had household incomes of less than $20,000. 17%. In 2011, it's 31%. So in that 4-year gap, there's a jump in the number of households, Muslim households, making less than $20,000 a year. Now, some of this is the same sort of economic driver that affected the general public in terms of unemployment, et cetera. And a lot of that is, but a lot of it is also this issue of different immigrants. And so those immigrants very often are coming in with lower social capital. And so they're coming into the labor market. But so this is just sort of a snapshot of, I think, the issue you're touching.
Can you please go to the integration slide? Yep.
This one?
No. Yeah. So unless there's a subset of questions under the question that you have, I'm just wondering, how does satisfaction translate into integration? Because a person may be well satisfied with his or her life because they're in a close-knit community talking to themselves. They still answer the question saying, I'm very satisfied. I live near a mosque, I have a community around me, I have nothing to do with the rest of society. So how does your satisfaction translate into integration? Unless there's some other questions that you asked after this.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of alluding before. There are some other questions that mathematically wind up being fairly highly correlated or pretty related. Are things like, do you think that the American public is generally friendly toward Muslims or not? Things like that, which get at some of these other issues that I think we're touching on.
Yeah. You said because these surveys are really expensive. I mean, you are really, it's difficult to find the relative questions. So how do you define your relative questions? Is it like For example, an institution in government or an army or whatever just need this data, and they offer the question to you, and you do. And how does it work? If someone needs a question to be asked, so is there any way, for example, to be added to your list? I mean, how does that
So
being like?
that's a good question. And in a lot of my presentations, I open with, this is the Pew Research Center, and this is how we develop our questions, and this is how we get funded. And I sort of glossed over that here, but it's probably worth taking a step back and having that conversation. So the Pew Research Center calls itself a fact tank. So we go through the exercise of sort of collecting data and disseminating it to the public. We're nonpartisan, non-advocacy, and we don't, by and large, we're primarily self-funded. We're an arm of the Pew Charitable Trust. The Pew Charitable Trust gives us fairly large block grants every few years. It says, here's a few $1 million, go do something useful for the American public. There's a mission statement about providing information to the public. And sort of the founding assumption of the Pew Research Center is that with better information, people will make better decisions. That's sort of the reason why we exist, because the founders thought if people had better information, they'd make better decisions. And so, we choose our topics and we choose our questions on the basis of things where there isn't already good information and there are important decisions to be made. Now, that said, there's still a lot of room in terms of how we organize the questions, what questions we ask. We don't take, we take outside, the organization takes outside funding. People will occasionally donate, $500,000 to the research center. They think the research center is great. They want the money. No anyone like that. So I have many questions. Just added to but even in those cases where someone says, you guys do great work, here's $1 million, you still don't get to write questions. You still don't get to pick topics. You can come and say, I think you guys do great work, here's $1 million. And now will you go do this survey for us? And we'll say, thank you for your $1 million. No. I mean, we have a very sort of strong wall between the funding side of the organization and the actual research side. Because we need to be nonpartisan, non-advocacy. And it's very easy to go down this sort of slippery slope of, well, it wasn't that, it wasn't a perfect question, but for $1 million, maybe we can, we don't want to go down that road. So we have a pretty strict separation. As a researcher, I have nothing to do with the funders at all. I know that most of that my salary gets paid basically by the Pew Charitable Trust grants, and that beyond that we get funding to do some of these larger surveys. But the details are invisible to me, and that's just fine. The decisions are made on the basis of editorial value, on the basis of lack of sort of other data that's available, sort of on these sort of research.
Depends on, maybe one more question, or any more?
Yeah, controversial. I'm an American who is an expat. I've lived in New York for the last 25 years. And I was shocked after 9/11 at the failure for the American society to have a serious discussion about the role of foreign policy. Do you ever take issues up like that and try to influence public policy makers?
No, we don't ever try to influence public policy.
Well, not influence them, but provide them with information that would make them be reflective about things they don't normally think about.
Yes, we do. I mean, I think a lot of our surveys tap into questions of foreign policy, and we like to think that knowing what people think about these issues, or what people know about these issues, what people don't know about these issues, is helpful to policymakers. And we do periodically
Although we don't take funding, we don't take government funding, we will periodically do briefings for government innovation, the same way I'm doing it, presentation here. Similarly, if I were invited by the State Department or something, I would give a presentation to them. But all of our data, again, is publicly available.
Wow, that's a wealth of information. Are there, I think other people want copies of these, are there more copies? Did you bring these, or are they
I
just?
did bring them, I can get some more copies if you like, send them to the center.
Yeah, that'd be great. And force people to come in and donate. And this is, but I hope, I recommend all of you, if people have questions, go onto the Pew site, and it's very easy to find. And the Global Muslim Survey, the U.S. Muslim Survey, it's really fascinating. And if you're a student, it's great for research papers, like my students. If you're a professor, it's great to assign students to look at. And if you're neither, it's just fun to read and interesting. So thanks very much for sharing. We'll also have you back very soon.